In Washington, people think power screams. They think it's all about pounding gavels, slamming doors, flying subpoenas. They think it's about raised voices in committee rooms, finger-pointing on C-SPAN, and viral moments that trend for exactly 3 hours before the next scandal takes over. But they're wrong. Real power, it doesn't scream. It doesn't have to. Sometimes power just walks into a room that smells like old wood and stale air, carrying a plain manila folder, and asks a question so simple, so quiet, you'd almost miss it if you weren't paying attention. Who signed the budget? That's all Jasmine Crockett said. 5 words. Quiet, controlled, almost gentle, like she was asking about the weather or wondering if anyone wanted coffee. But in that silence that followed, everything shifted. The air got thicker, shoulders tensed, eyes darted. Because sometimes the smallest questions carry the biggest weight. There were no cameras in that room, no CNN reporters with their perfect hair waiting for a soundbite, no Twitter-ready moments being crafted for maximum retweets, no staffers lined up against the wall, ready to clap for their boss's performance. Just 12 people around a mahogany table in a room where the law was supposed to live, where justice was supposed to breathe, where the people's business was supposed to get done. And one question hanging in the air like smoke. The building itself was intimidating. All marble columns and bronze eagles, the kind of place designed to make you feel small. Tourists walked by outside, taking selfies with the Supreme Court in the background, completely unaware that real power was being exercised in conference rooms they'd never see. They called it the U.S. Court of Appeals conference room, but it felt more like a bunker. A fortress built not just to keep chaos out, but to keep the truth in. Heavy oak doors, soundproof walls, windows that didn't open. The kind of place where careers were made and destroyed with whispered conversations and handshake deals. 12 people sat around that table. 4 federal judges, their black robes hanging on a coat rack like sleeping bats. 3 administrative staff members with their color-coded binders and nervous energy. 2 Treasury oversight officers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. 1 legal clerk, fresh out of law school, taking notes on everything. And Jasmine Crockett, sitting calmly with her hands folded. The air conditioning hummed quietly, mixing with the smell of old leather chairs and that peculiar scent of important papers, the kind that have been filed, stamped, and forgotten in government buildings for decades. Coffee cups sat half empty, rings staining the polished wood. Someone had brought donuts, but they sat untouched in their pink box, as if eating would somehow make this less serious. Jasmine didn't come to shout. She didn't bring a team of advisors whispering strategy in her ear. She didn't bring press or photographers or anyone looking to turn this into a show. She brought 3 things: a manila folder, a black pen, and a question. Who signed the budget? It wasn't some headline-grabbing budget everyone was talking about. Not the defense spending that made hawks and doves fight on Sunday morning shows. Not the foreign aid that got people calling their representatives. Not the infrastructure bill that every politician wanted to take credit for. It was something much quieter, much more boring. A line buried on page 742 of a federal appropriations report that most people would never read. Judicial Innovation Fund, $52 million purpose. Modernize internal court practices and enhance operational efficiency. Sounds innocent enough, right? The kind of bureaucratic language that makes your eyes glaze over. But underneath that boring description was a number that should have made everyone in that room sit up and pay attention. $52 million, with no project names, no invoices, no measurable outcomes, no timeline, no oversight. Just a vague promise of modernization and money that seemed to evaporate the moment it was approved. Most people wouldn't notice. Most people would see Judicial Innovation Fund and think, well, that sounds important, and move on to the next line item. But Jasmine noticed, and that's what made her dangerous. When she said it the first time, the court reporter, a thin woman in her 50s who'd been transcribing federal hearings for 20 years, paused. Her fingers, which had been dancing across the keys at 180 words per minute, stopped mid-sentence. Who signed the budget? The question hung in the air like a bell that had just finished ringing. You could feel the echo of it bouncing off the oak-paneled walls, settling into the leather chairs, finding its way into the spaces between words that nobody wanted to say. Judge H.C. Rowland, sitting at the head of the table in his crisp white shirt and conservative tie, didn't answer right away. He was the kind of man who was used to being the smartest person in the room, the kind who'd built his career on never being caught off guard. But for the first time in years, his carefully composed face cracked, just for a moment. A flicker between surprise and calculation, like he was rapidly running through his options and not liking what he found. Because this question wasn't about a number on a spreadsheet. It wasn't about bureaucratic procedures or administrative efficiency. It was about responsibility. And in rooms like this, responsibility was heavier than any sentence ever handed down from the bench. The younger staffers shifted in their seats. The Treasury officers adjusted their glasses. The legal clerk's pen stopped moving across her notepad. Jasmine placed her manila folder on the table with the kind of deliberate care that made everyone pay attention. It wasn't thick, maybe an inch of papers, but it landed on that polished mahogany with the weight of a gavel. The label on the front was typed in simple black letters: Judicial Innovation Fund, GAO Request 2020-2025. She opened it to the first page, and those closest to her could see what she was looking at. Nothing. A blank page with the official letterhead of the Government Accountability Office, but nothing else. No data, no reports, no explanations. She turned to the next page, also blank, and the next, still blank. The soft sound of paper brushing against paper filled the silence. Page after page, each one as empty as the last. The only sound in the room was that gentle rustling and the quiet hum of the air conditioning. 20 pages, 50 pages, 100 pages, until she reached page 142, all blank. She looked up then, her eyes moving slowly around the table, making contact with each person for just a moment. Not aggressive, not accusatory, just present, like she was taking inventory of who was there to witness this moment. And then she repeated the question, softer this time, but somehow it felt louder than before. Who signed the budget? No one spoke, not the judges with their decades of experience, not the staffers who'd seen every kind of political theater, not the Treasury officers whose job it was to track federal spending. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a case of incomplete paperwork or bureaucratic delays. This was exposure, pure and simple. $52 million doesn't disappear by accident. It doesn't vanish into thin air because someone forgot to file a report. It disappears when people in power decide that no one important enough will ask questions, but someone just had, and Jasmine Crockett wasn't going anywhere. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. In government hearings, 30 seconds of silence is an eternity. It's the kind of pause that makes people wonder if the audio has cut out, if someone's having a medical emergency, if the world has stopped spinning. Judge Rowland finally cleared his throat, a small sound that seemed to echo against the paneled walls like a gunshot. He reached up and adjusted the collar of his shirt, then his tie, then the cuffs of his jacket. The kind of nervous fidgeting that successful people do when they're trying to buy time to think. He glanced at the manila folder, then at the blank pages spread across the table, then finally at Jasmine. His voice, when it came, was carefully modulated, the tone of a man who had spent decades believing that people would accept whatever answer he gave them, as long as he said it with enough authority. "We don't manage those funds directly," he said, each word chosen with the precision of a surgeon. "The approval process goes through the clerk's office. There are established procedures, protocols that have been in place for years. We oversee the judicial system, not the day-to-day financial operations." It was a good answer, the kind of answer that would have worked in most rooms with most people. It had all the right elements: delegation of responsibility, reference to established procedures, just enough bureaucratic complexity to make follow-up questions seem petty. But Jasmine didn't move. She didn't nod politely. She didn't look away or shift in her seat or give any of the social cues that would have let him know his answer was accepted. She just sat there, her hands still folded, her eyes still steady, her expression completely neutral. And then, without breaking eye contact, she reached for the manila folder again. The sound of her fingers on the pages was impossibly loud in the quiet room. She flipped through several blank pages with deliberate slowness, as if she was looking for something specific. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard, ready to transcribe whatever came next. Jasmine found the page she was looking for and held it up so everyone in the room could see it clearly. "This is the internal approval form," she said, her voice as steady as the marble columns outside the building. "Form 847B, request for extraordinary budgetary allocation, dated March 28th of this year." She paused, letting everyone take in what they were seeing. The form was official, complete, properly formatted. It had all the right stamps and reference numbers. It looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. Then she rotated the page slightly and tapped the bottom right corner with her finger. The signature was right there, in blue ink, clear as day. Justice H.C. Rowland. Not a stamped signature, not a digital copy, not an assistant's initials. His actual signature, in his own handwriting, with that distinctive flourish on the R that anyone who'd seen his court orders would recognize. The air in the room changed. Not the temperature, the air conditioning was still humming at exactly 68 degrees, but the weight of it, the pressure, the way it felt to breathe. Everyone's shoulders seemed to tighten at the same time. Eyes darted from face to face, but nobody spoke. The judge looked at the page. His eyes focused on his own signature for a long moment, as if he was trying to remember signing it, trying to remember what he'd been thinking, trying to remember if there was any plausible way to explain this away. But there wasn't, because signatures don't lie. They don't forget. They don't misremember or miscommunicate. They just exist, frozen in time, marking the exact moment when someone decided to put their name on something. He didn't deny it. He didn't reach for the folder to examine it more closely. He didn't claim it was a forgery or a mistake. He couldn't, because everyone in that room knew what his signature looked like. Instead, he just exhaled, a slow, tired sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "I sign dozens of documents every week," he said quietly. "Hundreds, maybe. Court orders, administrative approvals, budget requests. It's part of the job. You can't expect me to remember every single piece of paper that crosses my desk." It was the kind of response that was meant to close the door, to put a period on the conversation, to move everyone along to the next item on the agenda. The kind of response that said, "This is boring administrative stuff, nothing to see here, let's all get back to our real work." But Jasmine didn't move along. She didn't accept the dismissal. She didn't even blink. She just looked at him with those steady, patient eyes. And when she spoke, her voice was quiet enough to make everyone in the room unconsciously lean forward to hear her. "A signature may be a habit," she said, "but $52 million is a responsibility." Those words landed in the silence like stones dropped into still water. You could almost see the ripples spreading out from them, touching every person in that room, making them all suddenly aware of the weight of what they were discussing. Because this wasn't just about oversight procedures or administrative efficiency. This was about what happens when people in power start treating signatures like reflex actions, when they start treating public money like monopoly money, when they start believing that their positions make them immune to the basic accountability that everyone else has to live with. It was about what happens when the system that's supposed to serve the people starts serving itself instead. And Judge Rowland, sitting there in his expensive suit with his decades of experience and his reputation for integrity, was starting to realize that those ripples were going to reach much further than this room. The judge looked away then, not down at his hands, not at the papers on the table, not at the blank pages that had started all this. He looked toward the window, toward the heavy curtains that blocked out the afternoon sun, as if he could find some answer there. It wasn't guilt in his eyes. Judge Rowland had been in the system too long to feel guilty about something like this. It was calculation. The rapid mental math of a man who'd spent his career weighing risks and benefits, who understood that every decision had consequences, who knew that the next few minutes were going to determine how the rest of the story played out. Because he knew what came next wasn't about his memory of signing a form. It wasn't about the complexity of judicial administration or the challenges of managing federal budgets. It was about his name, written in blue ink, attached to $52 million that no one could account for. The thing about being in power is that you can get away with forgetting a lot of things. You can forget campaign promises, forget who donated to your election, forget which lobbyist took you to dinner last week. People expect politicians and judges to have selective memory. It's almost part of the job description. But you can't forget your signature, because your signature is you. It's the one thing that can't be delegated or explained away or blamed on staff. When you sign something, you're saying, "This is mine. I take responsibility for this. I put my name on it." And forgetting doesn't erase that responsibility. It just makes it more obvious that you weren't paying attention when you should have been. Jasmine didn't press him further. She didn't need to. She'd already done the damage she needed to do, not by accusation or confrontation, but by confirmation, by showing everyone in that room exactly what accountability looked like when it was absent. She let the silence settle around them like dust, and then she did something that somehow made everything worse. She turned to the next page in her folder. Judicial Retreat Leadership Development Program, she read aloud, her voice as calm and steady as if she was reading the weather forecast. $2.8 million. She paused, letting the number hang in the air. Internal Communication Enhancement Initiative, $1 million. Still nothing from the other side of the table. Digital Workflow Optimization Pilot Program, $6.8 million. She stopped reading and looked up, her eyes moving from face to face around the table. The court reporter's fingers were moving again, capturing every word, every pause, every moment of silence. Judicial Leadership Retreat Series, $3.2 million. Another pause. Advanced Case Management Technology Integration, $4.7 million. The numbers were adding up, not just in dollars, but in the weight of what they represented. Each line item was another decision, another approval, another signature on another form that nobody had bothered to track. Enhanced Courtroom Security Assessment Protocol, $2.1 million. Jasmine closed the folder and looked around the table one more time. When she spoke, her voice was softer than before, but somehow it carried more weight. Does anyone here know who received these funds? No hands went up, no voices spoke. Just the quiet shifting of bodies in leather chairs, the soft sound of papers being shuffled, the invisible weight of a truth that had finally found its way into the light. She let the silence stretch out, letting it fill the room like water filling a basin. The old clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second marking another moment that the people in this room had to sit with what they'd just heard. Then she broke the silence with the gentlest possible question. If you don't know who received it, why did you approve it? It didn't sound like a confrontation. It didn't sound like an accusation. It sounded like curiosity, like someone genuinely trying to understand how a system that was supposed to protect the public interest had somehow lost track of tens of millions of dollars. But curiosity, it turned out, was more devastating than anger, because anger could be dismissed, deflected, met with anger in return. Curiosity just sat there, waiting for an answer that made sense. And no one in that room had an answer that made sense. The hearing ended at 4:47 p.m. No dramatic conclusions, no demands for resignation, no pounding gavels or raised voices, just a quiet, "Thank you for your time" from the committee chair and the soft sound of people gathering their papers and filing out of the room. But something had changed. You could feel it in the way people avoided eye contact as they packed up their briefcases. In the way conversations that should have happened in the hallway just didn't. In the way Judge Rowlands sat alone at the head of the table for a full minute after everyone else had left, staring at the blank pages that were still spread across the mahogany surface. There was no press conference outside, no reporters shouting questions, no official statement from the court. The tourists were still taking selfies with the Supreme Court building, still completely unaware that anything significant had happened. But inside the system, something had cracked open. The first sign came 3 days later. A plain manila envelope appeared on the desk of Sarah Chen, a staff attorney at the Government Accountability Project, a small nonprofit that nobody had ever heard of, operating out of a cramped office above a Vietnamese restaurant in downtown D.C. Sarah almost threw it away. No return address, no official letterhead, just her name written in careful block letters and a D.C. postmark from 2 days earlier. But something made her open it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. We tried to raise concerns about the Judicial Innovation Fund last year. We were told to focus on our regular duties and not to bring it up again. We were told that administrative efficiency was not our area of responsibility. We were told that asking questions about approved budgets was beyond our scope. We stopped asking questions. We shouldn't have. There was no signature, no contact information, no way to trace where it had come from. But attached to that single sheet were photocopies of documents that made Sarah's hands shake as she read them. Meeting minutes from a judicial administration staff meeting dated 8 months earlier with several lines redacted in black marker. Internal memos between court administrators discussing budget presentation strategies and oversight coordination. Email threads between Treasury liaisons and judicial staff with subject lines like FY budget review, timing considerations, and GAO audit schedule, coordination required. A handwritten note on official letterhead, delay implementation reporting until after FY transition. Coordinate with Oversight Committee liaison for optimal timing. Each document told the same story. People had noticed. People had asked questions. People had raised concerns about money that was being spent without clear accountability. And people had been told to stop asking. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. Questions raised in March, warnings issued in April, silence enforced by May. A systematic effort to make sure that concerns about the fund were kept quiet just long enough for the paper trail to cool down, for the audit cycle to pass, for everyone to move on to other priorities. But Jasmine's question had done more than expose the missing money. It had broken something deeper. The assumption that silence could be maintained indefinitely, that accountability could be postponed until it was convenient, that the system could police itself without anyone from the outside asking uncomfortable questions. The first story appeared not in the Washington Post or the New York Times, but in a small legal blog called Federal Transparency Watch that had maybe 3,000 subscribers, mostly lawyers and policy wonks who cared about government accountability. The headline was deliberately boring: questions raised about Judicial Innovation Fund documentation. The story was only 4 paragraphs long. It mentioned no names, quoted no sources, made no dramatic accusations. It simply reported that a congressional representative had asked questions about a federal fund during a routine oversight hearing, and that the documentation provided in response had been incomplete. But buried in the 3rd paragraph was a single sentence that made those 3,000 subscribers sit up and pay attention. The fund, which has disbursed over $70 million since 2020, appears to have no publicly available documentation of specific expenditures or measurable outcomes. $70 million, with no documentation. Within 6 hours, the blog post had been shared on Twitter 847 times, not by celebrities or politicians or anyone with a verified blue checkmark, by lawyers and accountants and former government employees who understood what that sentence meant. By the end of the day, it had been shared 3,200 times. 2 days later, a user named @BudgetWatchdog2023 posted a 7-second video clip on TikTok. No background music, no flashing text, no dancing or trending audio, just a simple screen recording of C-SPAN footage showing Jasmine Crockett sitting in that conference room, looking directly at Judge Rowland and saying in her calm, clear voice, "Who signed the budget?" The clip was so short that TikTok almost didn't process it. But something about the simplicity of it, the directness of the question, the way Jasmine's voice carried such quiet authority, made it impossible to ignore. It was reposted 127 times in the first hour. By the end of the first day, 8,000 reposts. By the end of the week, 300,000 reposts. But it wasn't just the numbers that mattered. It was who was sharing it and why. Law students at Georgetown and Harvard were stitching the clip with their own commentary about government accountability. Retired federal prosecutors were duetting it with explanations of what signatures mean in federal contracting. Former congressional staffers were adding their own stories about budget oversight and the importance of documentation. And in the comments, anonymously, people who'd worked in the system were starting to tell their own stories. I worked in federal procurement for 12 years. Everyone knew about funds like this. Everyone knew they were black holes. No one wanted to be the person who asked questions. My supervisor told me once that some budgets are politically sensitive, and it's not our job to dig too deep. I should have asked what that meant. I remember seeing line items like this and thinking it was weird, but I was just a clerk. I thought someone above me had it handled. The system that had operated on silence and assumptions was suddenly finding its voice, and that voice was saying, "We knew, we all knew, we just didn't know anyone would ever ask." Jasmine didn't hold a press conference, didn't post victory threads on social media, didn't demand accountability in front of microphones or cameras, didn't call for resignations or launch into speeches about government waste. She just kept going, reviewing documents, taking meetings, following paper trails that others had ignored for years, because she didn't need headlines. She needed clarity. She needed answers. She needed to understand how a system that was supposed to protect the public interest had become so comfortable with losing track of the public's money. In Washington, people mistake noise for progress. They think change comes with hashtags and chants, staged walkouts and trending clips. They think accountability requires someone to go on cable news and shout about corruption, someone to write angry tweets about government waste, someone to hold dramatic press conferences with charts and graphs. But real change? It comes in quiet, relentless questions. Questions that don't go away just because people stop answering them. Questions that burrow into the system like water finding cracks in concrete, slowly but inevitably breaking apart the structures that had seemed so solid. And so Jasmine's question kept echoing through the halls of federal buildings, through the cubicles of government employees, through the offices of administrators who were suddenly realizing that their comfortable assumptions about oversight were about to be tested. Who signed the budget? Inside Treasury offices, staff began rechecking expense reports, cross-referencing signatures with dates, finding gaps they'd never noticed before. Inside the Court of Appeals, clerks whispered about Jasmine's binder of blank pages, wondering what other funds might have similar documentation problems. Inside the judge's chambers, Justice Rowland sat late into the night, lamplight reflecting off papers he'd signed without reading, thinking about the weight of responsibility that had somehow become as light as air. The words replayed in his mind. A signature may be a habit, but $52 million is a responsibility. And for the first time in years, he was asking himself questions he should have been asking all along. 3 weeks later, an internal Treasury memo leaked to the Washington Post. We recommend no further disbursements from the Judicial Innovation Fund until an internal audit can be completed and documentation requirements can be clarified. 2 weeks after that, the first public hearing was announced. Not a closed-door administrative session, but a full congressional oversight hearing with cameras, with live streaming, with C-SPAN coverage, with reporters from every major news outlet in the country. The headlines finally arrived, but Jasmine didn't change. She walked into that hearing room carrying the same manila folder she'd had in the conference room, placed it on the table with the same deliberate care, and opened it to the same blank pages. "On the record," she said, looking directly at Judge Rowland, "let's try this again. Who signed the budget?" They tried to change the subject, talked about court backlog reduction, courthouse renovation projects, community trust initiatives. They thought if they layered enough paperwork, enough acronyms, enough process updates over the question, it would get buried under the weight of bureaucratic complexity. But Jasmine's question wasn't going anywhere. It cut through the jargon like a knife through butter, exposing the simple truth that no amount of administrative doublespeak could hide. They had spent $70 million of taxpayer money, and they couldn't explain what they'd gotten for it. The hearing lasted 4 hours. 4 hours of carefully prepared statements, of deflection and obfuscation, of attempts to turn a simple question about accountability into a complex discussion about judicial administration. But every time the conversation drifted away from the central issue, Jasmine brought it back with that same calm, steady voice. Who signed the budget? And every time the answer was the same uncomfortable silence. In that hearing room, the lights were too bright, the microphones too sensitive, and the cameras finally present, capturing every blink and swallow, every nervous gesture and uncomfortable pause. The room was packed with people who understood the significance of what was happening. Federal prosecutors who'd built careers on following paper trails, accountants who specialized in government auditing, former congressional staffers who knew the difference between legitimate bureaucratic complexity and deliberate obfuscation. And sitting in the back, taking notes, were reporters from news organizations that had been investigating similar patterns in other departments, other agencies, other funds that had somehow managed to spend millions of dollars without leaving much of a paper trail. Justice Rowland sat at the witness table, looking older than he had a month earlier. The Treasury officers were there too, along with administrators from multiple departments who'd been asked to explain their own similar funds, their own missing documentation, their own signatures on forms they couldn't remember signing. But the person everyone was watching was Jasmine Crockett. She didn't perform. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't speak in sound bites or deliver prepared speeches. She didn't grandstand or pontificate or use the hearing as a platform for broader political points. She just asked questions. Simple, direct questions that cut through decades of bureaucratic assumptions and got to the heart of what government accountability was supposed to look like. On March 28th, Justice Rowland signed Form 847B, approving $52 million in funding for the Judicial Innovation Fund, she said, lifting the binder filled with blank pages. "This is what we received in return." She flipped a page. Blank, another blank, another blank. The discomfort in the room was so thick you could feel it pressing against your chest. Cameras captured staffers glancing at each other, judges looking away, Treasury officials pretending to take notes on nothing. "You approved it. You spent it. Now tell us what we got for it." They tried to answer. One staffer stammered about internal modernization initiatives. Another mentioned technology infrastructure upgrades. A third referenced future capacity building investments. All the right words, all the bureaucratic language that was supposed to make vague spending sound important and necessary, but it was just words floating in the air without any substance behind them. Jasmine just listened. Then she placed her hand on the blank reports and asked the question that cut through all the jargon. Where is it? No one had an answer, because there was no answer. $70 million had disappeared into a system that had forgotten how to ask basic questions about what it was doing with the people's money. People think corruption is loud. They think it's stacks of cash in duffel bags, secret meetings in parking garages, encrypted phone calls between politicians and lobbyists. They think it's the stuff of movies and scandals, dramatic and obvious and easy to spot. But the worst corruption doesn't look like that. It looks like silence. It looks like polite smiles and routine approvals. It looks like signatures on forms no one reads, approvals without audits, funds moved in spreadsheet lines that vanish under layers of bureaucracy. It looks like a system that has become so comfortable with not asking questions that it forgets why questions matter in the first place. Jasmine knew this. She didn't need them to confess or crumble or break down on camera. She just needed them to see it, to see themselves in the reflection of a blank page stamped with their signature, to understand that somewhere along the way, they'd stopped thinking of taxpayer money as real money, stopped thinking of their signatures as real responsibility, stopped thinking of accountability as something that applied to them. The hearing ended with no resolution, no dramatic confessions, no promises to do better. The committee chair thanked everyone for their transparency and cooperation. Treasury officials promised a thorough review and enhanced oversight procedures. The judges left without looking at Jasmine, without acknowledging that anything significant had happened. But something had happened. Something that couldn't be taken back or covered up or buried under more bureaucratic language. The truth had been exposed, not through leaked documents or whistleblower testimonies or investigative journalism, but through the simplest possible method. Someone had asked the question and demanded an answer. Jasmine gathered her binder, still heavy despite being empty of anything useful. She didn't look angry or frustrated or disappointed. She looked patient, like someone who understood that accountability isn't a moment, it's a process. As she walked out of the hearing room, a reporter tried to get a comment. "Congresswoman Crockett, do you think you made your point today?" She stopped, turned, looked the reporter in the eye with that same steady gaze that had made Judge Rowland so uncomfortable. "Ask them," she said simply. Then she walked away, leaving behind a room full of people who were finally beginning to understand that the age of unquestioned authority was over. That clip went viral within hours. Not the entire 4-hour hearing, but those 10 seconds. The reporter asking if she'd made her point, Jasmine's 2-word response, the look in her eyes that said everything that needed to be said. Millions of people watched it within the first day, tens of millions by the end of the week. Because it wasn't about $52 million anymore. It wasn't about the Judicial Innovation Fund or Treasury oversight or bureaucratic accountability. It was about something much bigger and much simpler. It was about what happens when someone finally says, enough. It was about what happens when a system built on silence and assumptions meets someone who isn't afraid of either silence or truth. Who signed the budget became more than a question. It became a rallying cry, a meme, a shorthand for the kind of accountability that people had been waiting for without even knowing they were waiting for it. Young attorneys tagged it on social media posts about systemic government waste. Activists added it to transparency hashtags. Watchdog accounts paired it with every story of public funds lost to vague modernization programs and innovation initiatives. But it wasn't just the online activism that mattered. It was the conversations happening in government offices, in federal buildings, in the places where the real work of administration gets done. People were tired of money vanishing into innovation black holes, tired of being told that accountability was too complicated for ordinary citizens to understand, tired of watching people in power sign away public funds and walk away untouched. Jasmine didn't create that frustration. She just gave it a voice. She showed people that it was possible to ask simple questions and demand simple answers, even from the most powerful institutions in the country. She showed them that real power doesn't come from shouting or grandstanding or making dramatic speeches. It comes from being willing to sit quietly in a room and ask the questions that everyone else is afraid to ask. Within a week of the hearing, you could walk into any federal office in Washington and see the change. Staffers quietly flipping through past budgets, searching for similar line items. Administrators having whispered conversations about past approvals, questioning signatures they'd given without much thought. The Government Accountability Office announced a comprehensive audit of all innovation and modernization funds across the federal government. The Treasury Department issued new guidelines for documentation requirements. Several other departments quietly suspended disbursements from similar funds pending internal review. But the most significant change wasn't in official policy or formal procedures. It was in the culture of the system itself. For the first time in years, people were asking questions. Not just the oversight committees and audit teams, but everyday staffers, junior clerks, and even seasoned officials who had stopped questioning how things worked a long time ago. They were asking themselves, who signed the budget? And it wasn't just Jasmine's question anymore. It was the question that stayed with people when they left the office. It was the thought that made them pause before signing another approval form. It was the reminder that signatures aren't just routine, they're responsibility. Because somewhere along the way, the system had gotten comfortable. Comfortable with paperwork no one read, with funds no one tracked, with silence that kept everything moving. But now, the silence felt different. It was heavy. It was weighting. Real change doesn't always start with noise. It doesn't always come with press conferences or viral clips or fiery speeches. Sometimes, it starts when someone finally asks a question and refuses to stop asking. Who signed the budget? And that's how the system started to change, one quiet, relentless question at a time.